I just got a few.
Get them to have a seat.
Could I ask you all to please make your way to your seats? We are about to begin.
Jeff Friesen, please sit down. Hey folks, we're going to get started right away, so please grab your seats. And let's calm our hearts.
This space in which we will gather in over the next 2 days will be a space for reconnecting with old acquaintances and connecting with new. In this space we will eat together. We will be fed not only food, but information that we need to hear. Here we will discuss and listen and grapple and share hopes and voice concerns. Here we will take care of business. But this space, when we worship in it, becomes the house of God, where 2 or 3 or 300 gather in my name. There I am also. Let us worship. One light shines in the name of God, the maker of light, who lit the world with stars, sun and moon, and breathed the breath of life into all things.
One light shines in the name of Jesus, the revealer of light, who brought light into the darkness and stretched out his hand for us, giving his love to the whole world.
One light shines in the name of the Spirit, the inspirer of light, who lit the world from within and fills our lives with wonder in the search for learning and truth and wisdom.
We celebrate the Trinity of life and love.
God's presence everywhere. God's love for everyone.
God's inspiration of all things. Amen.
Let us bow for prayer. Your Mennonite churches of Canada gather, Lord, from as far as Grand Isle, British Columbia in the west, to Petitcodiac, New Brunswick in the east, from Dawson Creek, BC in the north, to Leamington, Ontario in the south, and all of us in between. Your church gathers, Lord. We come from cities, inner and suburbs, from town, from the farm. We are new to this country, and we have been here 5 generations, and we have been here from its start. We are women, men, younger, older. We worship you in ways that sound different from one another, in English, in Portuguese, in German, high and low, Mandarin, French, Spanish. Our songs are bolstered by piano and organ, drums and guitars, in 4-part harmony, or not. We don't all see things through the same lenses. We don't all agree on every little or big thing, but we are loved by you, and we love. May our praise and worship delight you. May our lives look like a love letter from God written by the Spirit to be read by the world. Bless our worship, bless this community. We love you, we thank you, we worship you. Amen.
Much of our music this weekend will go unannounced. You can find the songs and the words on the screens, or you can find the songs on your tables as well. Let's stand and sing together number 3 and Sing the Journey. Number 3 in your Sing the Journey.
Jesus calls us here to meet Him as through word and song and prayer. We affirm God's promised presence where His peace
can find the papers for this next song on your table. May your spirit give life.
One church always learning to live out our call. One Lord with eternal love who welcomes one and all. Though many members, we're one body with one faith. We pray you accept our deepest praise. May your spirit reveal, may your witness magnify, may your spirit renew, so your church may be inspired. May your spirit give life. We wait with expectant hearts to hear your voice. We offer our open minds and wait to be transformed. Each new discovery puts your brilliance on display. We pray for your peace while you create. May your spirit reveal, may your witness magnify, may your spirit reveal, so your church may be inspired. May your spirit give life. By grace we discover who we truly are. A ledger conceived in love and written on our hearts, declaring all that you have done through Jesus Christ. We pray that our lives can share your light. May your spirit reveal, may our witness magnify, may your spirit renew, so your church may be inspired. May your spirit give life. May your spirit reveal, may your witness magnify, may your spirit renew, so your church may be inspired. May your spirit give life.
Let's be seated.
I will be sharing from Ecclesiastes 3, verses 1 to 8. There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a a time to be silent, and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. Do you remember what you wanted to be as a child? Maybe you wanted to be a pilot, a builder, an artist, or a scientist. No matter what it was, it all began with a dream, a belief strong enough to make the unimaginable possible. When we became Mennonite Church Canada in 2000, we had new dreams for ministry, to become one church, one body, from the valleys of the east to the mountains of the west. We built a community through the words of a covenant, united by faith in Jesus and love for the scripture. It was a new age, continuing the legacy of our ancestors and building a visionary path for our children. Our ministry together has touched and changed many lives. We have much to thank God for and much to celebrate. Not all of our dreams have materialized the way we had hoped. We have loved the way we should have, and not the way we could have. We have felt included and excluded, whether by the distance between us or the silence among us. We need time to feel these emotions, and even more time to heal. But we must always remember that the church is people in relationship, in community together, not buildings, programs, or structures. Especially in this time of change and transition, perhaps God is calling us to trust that the Holy Spirit will guide us to a space where we are free to be inspired again. Our work begins with us. We are the tools. We are inspired to keep on dreaming. Do we have the courage to trust God? Can we allow ourselves to become vulnerable, to invite new dreamers, to keep on dreaming? We can, and we should be courageous in our vulnerability. In 2 Corinthians 3, we are advised that God has made us ministers of a new covenant. Such is the confidence that we have through Christ towards God, not that we are competent of ourselves to claim anything is coming from us. Our competence is from God, who has made us competent to be ministers of a new covenant. God continues to give dreams. The new covenant is a work in progress. We journey onward, joyfully. Who will receive these dreams? Your son, your daughter, your grandchild, your best friend? You. We give thanks to God whose light in Jesus gives us hope for a new covenant. We pray for the confidence that we have through Christ to inspire future generations with the hope and light of the new covenant. Amen.
One of our theme songs this weekend is New Earth, Heaven's New, number 299 in your hymnal worship books. Let's stand and sing in response.
There we go. We're going to spend some time in a certain part of Scripture this weekend, and it's going to come up again on Sunday, and we're going to read it together. So remain standing, and we're going to read from 1 Corinthians. Now, there we go, 2 Corinthians. My whole music stand fell apart, but 2 Corinthians, I invite you to speak the role of all, and I will speak leader. Are we beginning to commend ourselves again? Or do we need, as some do, letters of recommendation to you or from you? You yourselves are our letter of recommendation, written on our hearts to be known and read by all. And you show that you are a letter from Christ delivered by us, written not on ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts. Such is the confidence that we have through Christ towards God. Not that we are sufficient in ourselves to claim anything is coming from us, but our sufficiency is from God, who has made us sufficient to be ministers of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. Amen.
Number 44 in your Sing the Journey, The Love of God. Let's be seated.
Friends, sisters, and brothers, it is a pleasure for us, this group here, to lead you through worship this weekend. And we're glad that you are here and that you have given your voices so wonderfully to our first gathering of worship together as we begin our time together. And we thought that it is vital and important for us to first of all also acknowledge as we go into our business time that we want to recognize and acknowledge that we are meeting here on Treaty 1 territory, the traditional land of the Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and the whole land of the Métis Nation. This land is covenanted between Indigenous and settler peoples since 1871. And we also want to acknowledge that the water that we drink, mostly in Winnipeg and drinking here today, comes from Shoal Lake, which is in Treaty 3 territory. We are grateful to and for our host nations. Something else that you need to know, in the middle of your tables you will find some envelopes. And if you feel inclined or called to give an offering this evening, you can take that envelope, fill it out, and place it into the middle basket of your table. And today, if you turn to page 14 of your program guide, you will see all the information of where this offering is going to. It's going to support Common Word Bookstore and Resource Center, which is our national bookstore and resource center. So we invite you to do that at any time throughout the course of this evening. And as we transition, I invite you to take this blessing. Spirit of the living God, as we gather this weekend to worship, fellowship, and discern together, we ask you to continue to write on our hearts the story of your love. be the center of our thoughts, our words, and our actions this weekend. Be in our comings and our goings. And may we always remember that our sufficiency is found in you alone. And now may the words of our mouths and the meditations of our hearts be pleasing in your sight, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen.
Welcome to the 2017 Mennonite Church Canada Special Delegate Gathering. We come in the name of Jesus and as God's people to discern and live into God's mission in a way that reflects His love, grace, and mercy. Hi, my name is Calvin Guan, and I serve as moderator of Mennonite Church Canada. The Special Delegate Assembly is now called to order, and these sessions are now open. Our sessions are being live streamed, so we welcome you for those joining us online. And now, a note on quorum. Item 11, Section 1 of our bylaws state that quorum for a delegate assembly shall be 1/2 of the total number of eligible voting delegates from area churches, plus 150 voting delegates from constituent congregations. At our assembly, we have 33 of the possible 40 delegates from area churches, plus 292 congregational delegates, including 5 youth delegates. I therefore declare that we have quorum of delegates registered. I often find stats interesting, including delegates, guests, youth, staff, and volunteers. We have more than 412 in attendance at this year's assembly. Non-delegates are welcome to speak to issues under discussion, but may not vote. Others from your congregation who wish to speak into the assembly proceedings remotely can do so by contacting you, their delegate, via text, phone, or email. You would then be able to come to the microphone to voice those contributions. And as a reminder, proxy or online voting on decisions will not be possible. In keeping with our bylaws, the General Board has appointed the following officials to serve the Assembly. Please stand as your name is called. Our Resolutions Committee members are Bruce Berrigan, Laura Carprice, and David Dreger. During our delegate gathering, the Resolution Committee will be seated at the front of the meeting room, and its tasks are to prepare procedural resolutions, formulate motions and amendments when asked by delegated body or the moderator, and receive resolutions from delegates and ensure they are clear and appropriate. It helps to accommodate the process. Listening committee members are Terry Stefaniak, Annika Reiner, and Tim Wanger. They'll be wandering around throughout the sessions, reporting to us what they have heard. Harold Peters Franson will serve as parliamentarian for our 2017 Special Delegate Gathering proceedings. I invite Harold forward to remind us of how we work together.
Good evening. There's a lot of good advice around, and some of it you will find on pages 3 and 4 of your supplement, and I won't read that, but I'll make a couple of other comments. As parliamentarian, I'd like to review how, as members of the body of Christ, we want to conduct ourselves throughout our assembly. To begin, we engage our times of discernment and interaction in a spirit of unity as Christ taught us, relating with one another with respect, patience, compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and forbearance, being thankful for the gifts that each person brings to this assembly. As a people called to discern what God has called us to, together we do this through prayer, scripture reading, sharing information, silence, thought-provoking presentations, feedback, small and large group discussions, and individual expression and decisions. In all these ways, we seek the guidance of the Holy Spirit. To further guide our process, we utilize the guidelines for presenting and processing resolutions of the Mennonite Church Canada assemblies, General Board bylaws, and to a great extent, Robert's rules. Everyone, delegates and non-delegates, as has already been said, are welcome to discuss the topics over the next day and a half, both in roundtable discussions and at the microphones. However, our bylaws state that only those who are delegates can vote. Your congregation area churches have provided us with these designations, and it's indicated on your name tag. When engaged in an open mic forum, we ask that you respect the following. You're speaking to the whole delegate body, not to particular individuals. Comments should be respectful and gracious. And we are going to ask you, given the time, limited time, to keep your comments to 2 minutes, allowing others an opportunity. If the point you wish to make has already been made, we would ask that you not come to the mic. And to enable as many people as possible to speak, we would ask that you pay attention to how often you decide to speak. Please refrain from applauding in ways that show preference to a certain point of view. We are brothers and sisters in Christ, and we want to hear each other in all seriousness. A number of rules that we keep that are slightly different than Robert's, and one that we've decided for this session is that when we will be discussing the bylaw, replacing bylaw, we will ask that they will also have a 2/3 vote to make any amendment, as the whole resolution will have the same 2/3 vote. So keep that in mind as we move towards that. Thank you.
Thank you, Harold, for your helpful instructions and guidelines. I want to test with the delegates. Those in support of the guidelines just presented, would you please raise your hands? Thank you. I now want to pause for a moment so that we can affirm together how we want to engage one another during our time together at Assembly. Gathered as God's people, together we prayerfully affirm our desire to engage one another in a spirit of love, as Christ taught his disciples. I now want to call on Willard Metzger, Executive Director of Mennonite Church Canada, to come forward for some introductions.
Well, it is my thrill to add my welcome to you for this special assembly. And I do feel like I need to apologize on behalf of my whole team for the tight space that you may find yourself in. But quite frankly, at the early stages of our planning, as we were anticipating this, we weren't sure we might even be able to meet quorum, because we didn't know if enough people would want to come for such a short time frame, shorter than many assemblies. So once again, you have displayed your love for the church and for one another and have come out in strong numbers. And I thank God for you. So thank you. And it's because you're so good that you're so tight. So that's how it is. We are engaged in some very significant conversations this next day and a half. And it is good to have representation from our broader Anabaptist family with us to remind us that we are not alone. And so I want to introduce some of our guests with us. It is great to have Irvin Sitzman, and I'll have Irvin stand. He is the Executive Director of Mennonite Church USA, no stranger to you as delegates, but this is his last visit to Canada. He is retiring, and it is, I believe, in April, and so this is his last trip to Canada. So I know you are going to want to make sure he has a Canadian welcome and embrace that will take him throughout retirement. So make sure you seek him out. We're also happy to have Rick Kober-Bauman. Rick, if you would stand. This is one of his first duties, probably as the new Executive Director of MCC Canada. And I know that MCC Canada is such a part of who we are, so I know you're going to want to make sure you get to know Rick and introduce yourself to him. So thanks for being here. We're also happy to have Nelson Crable, President of Mennonite World Conference, with us. Again, a reminder that we are not alone as we continue to discern and make important decisions, but he's here representing the rest of our Anabaptist global family, and so we're delighted to have you here as well. And I'm very happy to have another one of our Canadian denominations here as well. I'm pleased to introduce Steve Berg, who is the Executive Director of the Canadian Conference of the Mennonite Brethren Churches. And so Steve is just going to give us a word of greetings.
Well, I know that every minute is precious, and that you've given me one of them is honoring to me and to us, the family that I've come to bring greetings from, and a rich sense of prayer and blessing for you as you're in these important meetings. I think we may be closer than cousins, but it's kind of like, it reminds me of when I went to visit relatives, and it was familiar, but it was still different, right? And I was sitting here this evening, just in the beginning part of it, saying, yeah, this is very familiar, I feel at home, but yeah, it's our family, right? And so I want you to know that we are with you both in spirit and prayer as you seek God's direction for important decisions in the days ahead. And I want to also say to you that Willard and I have become friends, which is a good thing. There's no point in being enemies when we're working together in these important matters, and have met numerous times in my early time here with the Mennonite Brethren. And so he and I both live out of town, but find ourselves head offices here, so travel a great deal. So I want to pray God's blessing on you, and may you know the direction and unity that God brings by his Spirit in the name of Jesus. God bless you in the day ahead. Thanks very much for the invitation to speak.
We are also very delighted to have, as has been stated, a few youth and youth delegates that are part of our gathering. And so I'd really like to welcome the youth that are here in attendance, so you see who is here. Please just stand where you are. It is so good to have you here. Thanks so much for being here. Make sure you add your personal welcome to them here as well. So thank you very much.
For our special delegate gathering, the interim council and the general board have a number of recommendations that will be presented for your consideration. Details of these proposals and recommendations are presented in the discernment guide. Our discernment process for each recommendation will begin with a presentation, followed by table group discussion and an open mic forum, and conclude with a vote. For the bylaw, there will be a ballot vote to approve the proposal, subject to any amendments that are approved. The bylaw change will require a 2/3 majority vote, as required by our current bylaw. This is the only item that requires a 2/3 majority. For the other items that we discuss, the votes will be to approve in principle the documents to the elected leadership for their continued work of leading the church. The recommendations for consideration this weekend are structure and bylaws, covenant and operating agreement, international witness, working group summaries, advance resolutions, financial plan, and slate. And I would refer you to the assembly schedule presented in the program guide, as this will guide the time and schedule for when these recommendations will be discussed and considered. The discernment process at our special assembly is very similar to the discernment process we use at a general delegate assembly. Where it differs is in focus. Our special delegate gathering focus will be on the proposed recommendations and any items relevant to the future directions covenant new material. Items not germane to this conversation will be referred to the general board or joint council, as the case may be, for further consideration and conversation. We have received 4 advanced resolutions. The 3 resolutions brought by Mennonite women, Mennonite men, and Mennonite voluntary service are presented in the program book. These resolutions are on the agenda for Saturday afternoon for consideration. We also received a resolution from Emmanuel Mennonite Church, Manitoba, proposing more church language in the bylaw. Wording for an additional section to the bylaw has been developed and reviewed with our resolutions committee and will be presented during the bylaw discussion. I now invite our nomination committee, Marguerite Jack, Eric Remble, and Waldemar Neufeld, to present the nomination slate. And as they come forward, we invite any nominations from you, the delegates, and we will be open to receive those nominations until noon tomorrow. We will vote on the final nomination slate Saturday evening. Our current bylaw, Section 14, subsection 1C, says that the nomination committee must receive nominations at least 24 hours before the scheduled election. Our parliamentarian has suggested that we change this timing requirement for our shortened assembly. And our general board is suggesting that we extend the time to receive nominations until noon Saturday. So I'd like to make the motion on behalf of the general board that we set aside Section 14, subsection 1C, that we accept nominations until noon Saturday, October 14th, with the vote to occur during the evening session, October 14th. Those in favor, please raise your hands. Carried. Thank you.
Thank you all. Your nominations for joint council are Calvin Kwan, who you've just seen, Alan Hebert. Do you want to stand, Alan? For Secretary Treasurer, and Geraldine Baltzer for Assistant Moderator. Is Geraldine here? There she is. I now invite nominations from the floor as per Calvin.
We now move to a presentation of the proposal for the new model and bylaw. This will be followed by table group discussion and an open mic forum. A vote will follow tomorrow morning on the proposal, and our resolutions committee will be available throughout the process of our discussion and discernment and be attentive to motions from the floor. And as ushers hand out the feedback forms to each table, I now invite Peter Rempel, moderator of Mennonite Church Manitoba, to come forward to review with us the key points of the model and bylaws. Details of this are in your discernment guide, pages 10 to 23.
Okay, I don't know why I got this job. One of the phrases that showed up on the screen here in that one song was, "The letter kills." So we're somehow going to have to bring the spirit into the letter of the bylaws. So that's going to be a job we share. So I want to give just some preliminary comments about the new model for our covenant, and then some preliminary remarks about the bylaws, and then just highlight the substantial changes in the bylaws from the previous one. So first of all, I think there's been a call for why are we doing this, or what's our ecclesiological rationale, or maybe in language that I understand, what's the churchly why for this? And we have covered this in the Future Directions Task Force report that was considered last year, and it is also in the material that we received in advance of this assembly. And I'd point you especially to the supplement, the first 5 pages. But perhaps it might be helpful for some of you, maybe helpful for me, if you heard some words of explanation or rationale from one regional moderator trying to provide a rationale. So here are some thoughts. The local faith community, which we call the congregation, is the essential and primary setting for an individual to experience Christian fellowship, worship, guidance, and mission involvement. With all churches, we have proclaimed Christ as the foundation of the church. Somewhat more uniquely in our tradition, we have operated with the notion that congregations form the foundation of our denominations. And so I think after a time of discernment, many of us have done individually, but that the Future Task Force also led in, I think we've come to the conclusion that at this time it is crucial that local faith communities, congregations, be vital and equipped for the nurture of individuals, whether members or children or neighbors or strangers, for mission in their context. I think one indication of this emphasis on the vitality and of equipping the congregation is that congregations and members of Mennonite Church Canada have applied an increasing portion of their resources, financial and other, to internal and local ministries, and are forwarding a decreasing portion to their denomination. And so this calls for a review of our model, our structure as a denomination. Essentially, the Future Directions report and recommendations that we considered and accepted a year ago reflect this theological understanding of the congregation and of the denomination, and the desire for a sustainable denominational structure. The proposed model for Mennonite Church Canada, now more delineated than last year, after much work by staff and boards of the national and area churches and by our transition coordinator, Keith Regier, intends threefold here: to build up and to build upon the congregations, to give the area churches, which we will now call regional churches, as the level in closest proximity to the congregations, a broader mandate and more resources to serve the congregations. And thirdly, to continue significant roles for the national church in networking regional churches, fostering denominational identity regarding our theology, our polity, and our ethics, representing our denomination on national and international levels, carrying out tasks which benefit or need a national base for efficiency and effectiveness, such as the administration of international ministries. I think another strategic goal we have in this is that congregations and individuals will perceive and experience their denominational affiliation, their churchly affiliation, in a singular or unified way, rather than the two tracks we now call upon in terms of commitment to the regional church and the national church. We want people to feel and perceive us as one united body. This model requires or involves covenants at several levels within our denomination: individuals to form congregations, congregations to form regional churches, and regional churches to form the national church. And there are, of course, innumerable covenants and relationships from each of these levels to external entities. At the national level to MCC and to Mennonite World Conference, or to the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada or the Canadian Council of Churches. Now I'd like to just move on to some comments about the membership and governance features of the new model. You'll find this summarized in the Discernment Guide, pages 6 and 7. You'll find the Appendix 1 presents a graphic depiction of the structure, and then the addendum has several pages on this. So here again is a brief summary. The regional churches form the partnership through a covenant for Mennonite Church Canada. The regional churches determine the programmatic priorities of Mennonite Church Canada, emphasizing the nurture of the worship, fellowship, discernment, and mission needs and desires of member congregations. The regional churches provide the financial resources for Mennonite Church Canada by sharing the resources contributed to them by the congregations and members in their region. The membership assemblies and boards of regional churches regularly engage national issues related to MC Canada's programs and positions, so that there will be attention given in our smaller regional church delegate gatherings that meet twice a year, rather than considering these matters at our larger gatherings every second year. In addition to our delegate gatherings, regular study conferences on theological and ethical topics open to all interested members, and regular gatherings of a community of spiritual leadership open to ministers and the theology teachers of our institutions provide opportunities for nationwide discernment, fellowship, and worship. The executive ministers of the regional churches, convened by the executive minister of Mennonite Church Canada, form the executive staff group for exchanging information and coordinating the work of the regional and national staff. And then moving into the area of the bylaws, which are covered in the bylaws, regional churches appoint delegates to the Mennonite Church Canada membership assemblies, and the regional churches also appoint representatives to the Joint Council, which replaces the General Board, while the MC Canada Assembly elects the 3 officers of the Joint Council. Now to start focusing on the bylaws some more. I think we should regard our starting point for our new covenant as the covenant agreement that is in Appendix 3. And then the bylaw is a way of implementing that covenant. But we are presenting the bylaws first because it's actually the one critical document that needs your approval for us to move ahead. The approval, and we need this, and on this basis then we will continue our deliberations about the other documents and proposals that you will be considering this week. The bylaw provides a platform, not a straitjacket, for discussing these proposals and presentations and working group reports in principle, accepting them in principle at this assembly, and then it provides the platform for further developing them and modifying them as we continue our life as Mennonite Church Canada. And that's a process that will involve delegates and a joint council and staff and more. Those of us who worked on the bylaws feel that we were guided by the decisions made in principle by the Saskatoon Assembly. We are also assured that we were in compliance with Canadian corporate law, and we are also guided by a concern for making a structure that was a governance and membership structure that was sustainable in terms of personnel and finances, and we tried for clarity and succinctness in the bylaws. So now I think I'll call on the screen to show some significant changes. So this is a list of what I would call the significant changes in the bylaw from the previous bylaw. The underlined ones are what I would consider, I would submit to you, are the substantial changes. So first of all, just a note on the definitions. I think you're probably aware of this, but several entities that will perform essentially the same functions as before have been renamed to emphasize the change intended with the new structure. And you see those changes, name changes, listed there. And maybe here I will just emphasize again that the covenant has been added to the list of definitions because it is really the, I'll say, the foundational document for the bylaws. Moving to point number 2 in the bylaws, the category of congregation members is removed so that only regional churches are eligible for membership in Mennonite Church Canada. That's following through on what was approved in Saskatoon. We go to section 7 under delegate gatherings. The representation at annual delegate gatherings will alternate between 2 delegates appointed by each regional church, and in alternate years, a broader representation of 6 members of a regional church's board, plus 5 additional delegates for each regional church, plus 1 delegate per 1,000 individual members, rounded up to the next 1,000. Also want to highlight under point 8, a significant addition to the duties and powers of the voting delegates are to discuss and approve policy statements and review the work performed by the Joint Council. One might ask, why did we miss that in previous bylaw? But I think it happened. Let's continue on to point 17. We can go there, get there slowly. Okay, we're there already. The composition of the Joint Council. In addition to the officers elected by the delegate body, the regional churches will be represented on the Joint Council by their moderator, plus 1 other representative appointed by the regional church who is not a member of its board. So that gives you the composition of the Joint Council. You just move down the page, you can scan the other changes. Just to note, under officers, it's proposed that the role of secretary and treasurer be combined so that normally there will only be 3 MC Canada officers rather than the 4 that we presently have. Now we can scroll down further to point 29. The provisions for the composition and duties of the Faith and Life Committee, the Christian Witness Council, the Christian Formation Council, the Church Engagement Council, the Joint Executive Committee with Mennonite Church USA, the moderator, secretaries, and area church members, ministers meeting. That got to be a very long acronym. MSCAM or something like that, I don't know. So, are removed, though the Joint Council is authorized to form new committees and task forces with specific tasks. And then finally, just to reassert, the amendments to the bylaws in the future may only be changed at a delegate gathering which has the broader representation. So with that, I forgot to look at the time. I'm sorry, but I've finished this presentation. Turn it back to Kelvin.
Thank you, Peter. We now invite you at your tables to discuss the questions on the feedback sheets that were just distributed and provide your responses on those sheets. You have 35 minutes, which brings us to 8:15. It is important to note that 2 of the questions ask for you to write only 2 comments. It is important for your table to provide the 2 responses that highlight what is most important to your group. These feedback sheets will be collected and typed up this evening, and tomorrow morning we will have a brief summary of the feedback before we continue our discernment. So with that, I invite you to move to your tables for responses to the sheets that you would have received. Okay, we have about 5 more minutes. If you have not already provided responses on those sheets of paper at your table, I would just remind you to do that. If you can do this so right now, that'd be great. Okay. We want to continue our time of discernment together, so if you can wrap up discussion at your tables, that'd be great. Thank you. Okay, before we continue our discernment time together, I'm going to invite Bruce Berrigan up from our Resolutions Committee to discuss in addition to the bylaw. So Bruce?
Thanks, Calvin. On behalf of the Resolutions Committee, prior to us arriving here and after our Resolutions Committee was struck, we started receiving emails from Keith and folks with possible resolutions. Most of them were already presented and are in your documents. One that came later came from Emmanuel Mennonite Church in Winkler, and we've had ongoing conversation with John Clausen with regard to that, and it has to do with adding some foundational language to the bylaws. The concern expressed by the congregation is that there's a sense as we move into this new structure that it is just about structure, and because we aren't at the same time dealing with a constitutional document that might have some of that, although there is one somewhere, but it's using some pretty old language by now, it was felt that it would be helpful to add one could use the term preamble. I'm a little uncomfortable with the word preamble in terms of not wanting to use that as a way of de-emphasizing the importance of it, but as something that doesn't actually speak to the structure, but it speaks to the foundation of why we would do this. Now, I don't know if we have this to be put up on the screen at this point. If we could, that would be helpful. So the idea would, the suggestion is that we would add a new section 2 entitled Beliefs and Commitments, and that as a community of believers, we affirm that Jesus Christ is the head of the church and the foundation upon which we build, 1 Corinthians 3:11. The following statements identify who God calls us to be, which guides our work and life together, and we reference the vision, healing, and hope statement and the statement of identity, and those are in your discernment guide as part of the covenant document as well. And so that's a sense of placing what it is that we do, who it is that we are, as a foundational piece inside the bylaw, and so that it's not just buried in documents that we can't find. And then another piece of this, and another part of their concern, was because the bylaws no longer refer to programmatic kinds of things, and so what is proposed to replace Council on Faith for Faith and Life is not actually embedded in the bylaws anywhere. It's in documents that say we're going to work on that, and there's, I think, a pretty good, strong commitment to go there, but it's not actually built in. There was a sense that they would like to have some kind of language around that as a body we would mutually discern. And so the suggestion, as the Resolutions Committee suggested that and this was agreed to by those that were making or asking for an amendment, was to suggest that we insert 4.1b. So if you go to your bylaws, section 4.1 is entitled Regional Churches Are Expected To. The first point A, subsection A, says give faithful attention to the scriptures, and it's suggested that we add a B, and then the rest, of course, would be lettered sequentially from there. And that would read, encourage and guide MC Canada in the process of biblical interpretation and spiritual discernment. And so instead of just referring to it as regional churches, we work at doing these things on our own, it's also part of the put into the bylaws that we would work at this together. And of course, some of that is also in the covenant language. The reason we put it bylaws as opposed to the covenant document, its language is very much aimed towards how we do things, how we work together. And the request was that it be put into the actual Mennonite Church Canada bylaw bylaws themselves. And General Board has agreed to move this as part of the bylaws, and it didn't get onto the table before your discussions, but it doesn't. I think the questions for our discussion were more around the structural issues, and so I think it's appropriate that it comes up now. I'm sorry. I was referring to the bylaws, and when I went to section 4, that is page 13 of the discernment guide. Thank you. I know, I got a big stack. I managed to find the right things when I came up here.
Thank you, Bruce. We want to provide you the opportunity for open discussion until 8:55. We invite you to bring your questions, comments about the model and the bylaw. Once we introduce the motion tomorrow morning, there will be an opportunity to offer amendments. And when you would like to speak, I would invite you to stand. We have 3 microphones, and I understand that folks will actually be seeking you out as they see you stand. And once I recognize you, you may speak. And I remind you of the agreements we made earlier, that to allow as many people to speak into this as possible, that we'll be giving each speaker 2 minutes. Our parliamentarian, Harold, will help me to keep time. So I turn it over to you. If you would like to speak at this point, please stand, and the folks with the microphones will be here to find you and give you a microphone.
Yes, my name is Ken Dewick from Zion Mennonite Church in Swift Current. I wish to speak against this motion when it's introduced. I believe the fundamental change represented in this motion is one which moves accountability of our national leadership away from the direct structural control by the local congregational delegates. And I do not think the case has been made for this change. I urge us to vote against the motion.
Thank you.
We just had a question regarding the amendments that were just up on the 4.1b. We weren't sure, how is that being suggested that it be slipped in? Is that replacing what's currently printed at 4.1b, or is that being added, in which case I didn't understand how that made a statement. Like just wasn't reading smooth, so I'm just wondering, where was that, how is that being inserted?
Okay, so the statement that's been inserted is actually an insertion, and everything else basically moves down.
Okay, so it's a new one, it's a new B, and then the current
correct.
B becomes C.
Becomes C, that's
okay.
right.
Thank you, that makes more sense.
Thank you.
I'm Kim Rempel from East Sora Mennonite in southwestern Ontario. Let me first say that I affirm this motion and the new structure. I think that placing the emphasis on the local congregation is a very positive thing. My concern is that there doesn't seem to be a lot of strategy to implement this. We hear a lot about congregational vitality and making the congregation the center for mission, but I don't think those things are just going to happen. And so I wonder if there could be a little more discussion around what regional churches can do to support congregations and how this new structure is going to trickle down to the congregations. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Claire Ewart-Fisher from Mount Royal Mennonite Church in Saskatoon. And I just have a question for clarification, and that is, we were told that the secretary and treasurer were going to become one position, and we were given no explanation other than they were going to reduce the number of officers in the executive. So I would like an explanation for why those two portfolios have been put together.
The rationale basically was we wanted to keep the joint council to a smaller size. And I guess also thinking that by now the secretary duties are often carried out by staff, so it is not as onerous as it once was. So it's basically an economy of size suggestion.
Marilyn Hauser-Ham, Altona Mennonite Church, Manitoba. This is a question of clarification. I am wondering if what we are being asked both to consider at this moment and tomorrow morning will be an approval of the bylaws, or at what point will we be able to raise either concerns or points of consideration for amendment for various aspects within the bylaws themselves.
Thank you. Yes, tomorrow morning we will have an opportunity to have a discussion. We'll present the motion and have discussion. At that time, offers for amendments will be accepted and for consideration.
Melissa Miller, delegate from Home Street Mennonite Church, and also speaking on behalf of this table group and as a board member of Menno Media. So one of the concerns that we raised here at the table are concerns about things falling through the cracks, like Witness, like Menno Media, like schools, and so we leave that as a question.
Yeah, maybe I just respond that certainly later in the agenda we will be looking at the witness proposal, so that's certainly part of our conversation. The Menno Media relationship with Menno Media, we see that as being housed with the common word, and so that would be a very natural connection to Menno Media, and that's how we'd see that moving forward.
Brent Hurst, delegate from St. Jacob's Mennonite in Ontario. One of the strengths, I think, of this proposal is actually that more congregations will have a voice at the nationwide church. And I say that because when we look at diversity and size of congregations and financial capability of some congregations, I think their representation at the regional churches is much better, and that is much more opportunity for that. And then we just have to trust that that message gets to the nationwide church. So I think that's a strength.
Thank you.
Gordon Drieger, Petitcodiac Mennonite Church. I'm very grateful for the addition of 4B
I think that's an important part of what we do as conference. Important enough that I would encourage, as we look at the guidelines and bylaws, to perhaps maybe put in something specific to say that every 4 years there was a theological gathering, something that's more than just good intentions, but something that we have to then, we're held accountable, that our gathering and our putting together our cauldron of theology and forcing us to talk to one another about what it means to be Mennonite, I think is essential. And I'd like to have a set date in there so that we have to do it as opposed to something we would like to do.
I would just like to speak to make a distinction between what are things that we address in bylaws and things that we address in other ways. So the matters of how we will work with making vital congregations will come up in the other proposals that we will talk about. Like as I said, the bylaw is a platform for how we will talk about it, how we will gather to talk about these things. In terms of, I agree very much that we need to make a commitment to have these regular other nationwide gatherings. I guess I would just caution against putting them into bylaws, because we may come to a situation where it just doesn't work to have something on the 4th year and then we're in violation of our bylaws. I would say let's put that into the operating agreement, which is also a binding document, which can be just a little bit more, we can allow for exceptions as needed.
Excuse me, Tom Yoder-Neufeld, delegate from First Mennonite Church in Kitchener. My concern is with the platform in some respects for these bylaws, namely the focus on the individual congregation as, I think I remember the word Peter used, foundational. I personally am deeply committed in both theology and in personal life to my congregation and doing everything I can to help vitalize the congregation. But I think there's a big theological question in the privileging of the congregation over the regional and nationwide and indeed global aspects of the church. I think there's a theological argument to be had, and we come from rather different ecclesial traditions that have been brought together into Mennonite Church Canada that have had a different history on this. So I just want to register a concern about what I might call congregational individualism, which I think is already the case. One of the reasons we're at this point in our history as MC Canada is because congregations have seen themselves to be the center of their churchly universe and haven't been particularly concerned about the others. So it feels to me a little, I have questions about whether the new structure might in fact, contrary to the intentions that we bring to this, further contribute to the kind of congregational individualism. If we're talking about regional churches resourcing these congregations, I think congregations need to have a sense of being part of something whole in order for them to receive the kind of resourcing that the regional church wants to give. So I guess I'm concerned about our theology. Thank you, Peter, for cutting me off.
Thank you. Actually, that was our parliamentarian. Thank you for that comment.
Having cut you off, I want to respond to you, Tom. I was very careful to try and say, in our tradition, we have deemed the congregations to form the foundation of the denomination. That's a polity question. I think theologically we will say that Christ is the foundation on which we build the church, whether it's building the national church or the regional church or the congregation. And there may be some hazards in the model generally that we would want to avoid in terms of getting so congregation-centric that we don't. So it will be up to the joint council and the regional bodies and so on to make sure we get that balance right. Getting back to the bylaws, I don't think the bylaws tip the balance either way in this respect. But I think let's keep your concern in mind as we work with the operating agreement and the bylaws.
My name is John Clausen. I'm from the Emmanuel Mennonite Church. In light of what I heard Tom say, I want to just speak again to the amendment that we shared, or that Bruce Berrigan shared on our behalf. I want to thank the Resolutions Committee for taking our concerns seriously. I think a large part of our concern was exactly some of the conversation we're having here. We wanted to make sure that our structure had a foundation. And we wanted to make sure that the center of what we were doing was not the congregation, but the center was Jesus Christ. If we're talking about using the language of Palmer Becker's work on what is an Anabaptist, talking about Jesus as the center, community is, Jesus, community, and reconciliation as the core pieces for us. And so both in that area and in the amendment around spiritual discernment, we felt by adding those two amendments, this would help in that regard, and that's why we're emphasizing it. I do have one question of clarification. When this is brought, or does this amendment need to be moved by someone? I think the General Board moved it, is that correct? Does that mean it's part of the package that we vote on tomorrow, or does it? Okay, thank you.
That's correct.
Patricia Regier from Niagara United Mennonite Church. I think it's great that there's a lot of intention with being equitable across the regional churches, and coming together and building those relationships for that national identity was something that we discussed. My question is there going to be some intention to make sure that those regional representatives also have some diversity for representing their constituents? So whether it's more equitable for male and female, and the diversity for the churches that we now have with various languages and cultural backgrounds as well, to be intentional about that.
Thank you.
I want to make one point in response to that, and then Keith Regier, our transition coordinator, who should also be introduced and brought to the platform here at some point next. The thinking, you notice when we said the formation of the joint council will be the moderator and one other person who is not a member of the board, because that gives us a wider set of people to choose from, because our boards tend to be fairly homogeneous in terms of ethnicity and gender, though not in Manitoba, and otherwise. So that's one way we addressed that in the bylaws. And Keith has already also done some work about addressing the diversity question in other ways.
So I just want to speak very briefly to the question of diversity. There was a document that went out sometime in the last week with some supplemental materials, including an update on the question of diversity. That has, throughout the conversations that we've been having with executive staff group and interim council, the question of diversity has been very, very live. And so much so that, in fact, we have retained a consultant who specializes in the question of diversity so that we can, as she frames it, build an ecosystem for diversity so that we're not just ticking little boxes. We've got this one, we've got this one, we've got that one, but actually shaping how we work and live together to make it easier for people who are normally more often marginalized to be part of our structures. Just one very simple example. The fact that we gather in some place around the country for leadership meetings makes it almost impossible for people who have hourly paid employment to participate in those meetings because they have to take vacation or they simply can't go because they cannot get the time off. And so she's going to be working with us on building an ecosystem that makes it possible for us to actually be as diverse in our leadership groups as we are as congregations.
My name is Diane Lichty, Tavistock Mennonite Church. I guess I'd like some more clarification. I know they're in the bylaws, but I don't hear a lot about, I hear a little bit about joint council, but there's also an executive committee and an executive staff group. And I'd just like to hear a bit more about those groups and a bit more clarification.
They're telling me just stay up here, Rempel. Okay. You want a distinction between the joint council and the executive committee and the executive staff group. The joint council is the governing body that will meet at least 4 times annually, composed of representatives of the regional churches, 2 from each, plus the officers elected by this body. And they are kind of the most immediate interface between the membership and the staff. And then there's the executive committee, which will consist of the officers and 1 other person, and they are there to deal with urgent, important matters that can't wait for a joint council decision, to allow the staff to test some recommendations before they bring them to the joint council, and to handle some confidential, sensitive matters that are should not be dealt with in a wider circle. So that's the executive committee of elected people. The executive staff group, I don't think they're listed in the bylaws because that's a more fluid body. It is the executive directors of the 5 regional churches, convened by the Mennonite Church Canada executive minister, and they are meeting almost monthly or bi-monthly in some way or other, and processing issues that come up that need some coordination among the regional churches. So that is the staff group. Does that suffice? Okay.
Gerald Gerbrandt, Bethel Mennonite in Winnipeg. I want to affirm Tom's concern about theology of the church. And perhaps the term foundation or foundational has led us into some difficulties. I very much like the addition that Emmanuel recommended regarding the foundation of the church being Jesus Christ. But I don't think the issue is with the bylaws as much as the rhetoric around it and the way it's being promoted, which virtually reduces church to the congregation. And in fact, the role of the larger structures appears to be primarily to assist the congregation in mission rather than participate in the mission. And so somewhere our notion of church must be larger than the congregation and include definitely regional and nationwide body. And so I share the concern that there seems to be an inadequate understanding of church in the rhetoric around the documents and in the vision that is reflected in them.
Thank you.
Michelle Rizzoli, Toronto United Mennonite Church. I find that there's, for me, something lacking under 4.1 about the expectations of members. If I'm reading this correctly, members here refers to the regional churches. Is that correct? I mean, just offhand, it looks like language that's talking about individual people and not an institution, but that's minor. I find that if indeed this is the model, there should be some expectation that the regional churches relate in some way to the congregations. Might be so obvious that it didn't make it in, but I think having an explicit expectation of either representation or communication, I don't know exactly what it would look like, but it should say something that they need to be connected with the congregations in some way.
Thank you.
Dave Bergen from Bethel Mennonite Church in Winnipeg. I noticed in the bylaws the use of language around positions, staff positions that are named, use either director or minister, and the position currently held by Executive Director Willard Metzger, the counterpart to that in the new structure is now called Executive Minister. But I noticed that the regional chief staff people are now becoming directors. And there is a concern, I think, I've heard it here on the floor, and it's my concern as well, that our documents, our foundational documents, reflect an ecclesial perspective. And I wonder about the term director for the chief leadership staff people in the regions.
Thank you.
Ray Friesen, pastor and a delegate from Emmaus Mennonite Church in Saskatchewan. With all due respect to those who I recognize as much more learned than I am in terms of our theological language around the church, I would say the emphasis on the congregation that I've seen heard in the conversation and seen in the documents is in fact an emphasis that gives our tiny congregation in a tiny community a much stronger sense that there is in fact a place for us in this larger body. And so I would hope that we could look at this not as an either or as is one being more misguided than the other, but rather as a balance that we'll keep working at.
Thank you.
Rick Koberbauman, Mennonite Central Committee Canada, and Peter, you can keep an eye on me. I'm not a delegate, so I won't vote. But I do want to speak to this question that's been very live for the last few minutes here and remind us that even when the denomination as a denomination is not necessarily active at the national or the global level, and the concern that it is only the congregation where that expectation lies, is that Mennonite Church Canada and the regional churches and congregations participate in many other ways in ministry. And I'm reminding us now mostly of MCC as a very direct ministry of the church. So when MCC went through its wineskins process a number of years ago, very intentionally connected itself again as a ministry of the Anabaptist churches, and certainly that includes Mennonite Church Canada. So I think we ought not to believe that the congregation is somehow the only place of ministry, because there would be many others besides MCC that I think are genuinely Mennonite churches in Canada showing up in other parts of the world in a very genuinely owned by Mennonite Church Canada ministry.
Thank you.
My name's Ryan Siemens. I'm representing Mennonite Church of Saskatchewan. I'm neither an executive director nor an executive minister. I'm technically an area church minister, though most people know me as conference pastor. So we're fairly inconsistent across the board on names for our roles. I don't know if it makes actually suggestions for what the area churches change that to in these bylaws, because those would actually have to be dealt with at the regional church level.
Thank you. I think we have time for maybe 2 or 3 more speakers.
Ben Castles, delegate from Waterloo Kitchener United Mennonite Church. My question has to do with review of the new structure and the covenant, as well as the bylaws that we are being asked to support. Is it possible to include either in the bylaws or our operational understanding some form of essentially a sunset clause that forces us into a larger review of whether this new structure that we are, I presume, approving is functioning in 10 years or 15 years or 20 years or whatever it is, so as to avoid a situation where we come to down the road all of a sudden an emergency situation where we have to again review all of our structure on a really tight timeline. Is there some way, whether it's in our bylaws or our operational document, to include such a sunset or review clause?
Thank you.
Am I on? Ernie Epp, delegate, Nutana Park Mennonite Church, Saskatchewan. In going through the bylaws, I'm very impressed with how much work has gone into it, and generally they do look thorough and very appropriate. I am noticing, I think, a gap which could cause us some difficulties. And I'm reminded of this when I see the programs like Formation Council, Witness Council just dropped, maybe unilaterally dropped. There's obviously reason for it. And I also recall very well the pain, anxiety, and tensions developed over staffing elements as Mennonite Church Canada first began to understand that it was in trouble and the ship was really wobbling. So I'm inclined to think that it would be important in the bylaws especially to have something that rather specifically and clearly articulates how Mennonite Church Canada is going to initiate and terminate programs. And I think there's an opening in the bylaws for doing such, but I don't see it articulated. And I would also think there should be something about a personnel policy that Mennonite Church Canada has. Some extremely serious employment issues have surfaced, and in church organizations, huge lawsuits have been launched because policies weren't followed. So I would encourage the group here to think about putting something in terms of program formation and termination and the employment practices of Mennonite Church Canada. Thank you.
Nelson Craybill from Mennonite World Conference. Resonating with the concerns of Tom and Gerald, I would commend this process for naming Mennonite World Conference at several places, and perhaps in the section where you identify confessional framework for our identity, you might mention there specifically Mennonite World Conference Shared Convictions, which is a one-page document that now has become the sort of confessional focus for 104 national bodies around the world, Mennonite bodies.
Thank you.
Randall Neudorf, delegate from MCEC, and I'm the pastor of the Commons in Hamilton. And I'm really excited about this new direction and the proposal. And I'm just so thankful for the Jesus statement that was added in as I think a gift, and just emphasizing that Jesus is the foundation. And I really feel like that addresses some of the concerns about the church being foundational. The church is the part that's closest to missional because, and I mean the local church, because the people live in neighborhoods and they get to see what Jesus is already doing in those neighborhoods, and they get the privilege of noticing it, getting together with their friends at the church and saying, this is what I noticed Jesus is doing, maybe we should get on board. I just feel like that missional direction has the most potential to notice Jesus at a local level. And so I just love the idea that there is an emphasis on local church, not because that's the point, but because they're the closest to noticing what happens in a neighborhood where Jesus lives. And so I'm just so excited about that, and it resonates with me, and I know it resonates with my church.
Thank you. Okay, I want to thank you for your engagement, for your feedback. I want to thank you for conversation on a topic that in normal conversations would typically cause eyes to glaze over. So I commend you for your engagement and your passion. As I mentioned earlier, if you could please make sure that ushers do collect those sheets that the table groups have summarized your responses to those questions. We'll be sure to summarize tomorrow morning what we're hearing, the feedback that we're getting, and we'll do that before we move into the vote and our continuation of our discernment process.
We have another matter before we move into our closing worship. The recent release of the General Board Confession and the paid advertisement in the Canadian Mennonite has created confusion, anger, and pain across our nationwide family of faith. Both of these statements have generated a variety of responses, questions, and concerns.
The General Board is very aware of these dynamics. While we have not had adequate time to process these matters, we are committed to engage in these developments pastorally following the conclusion of our special assembly. This then concludes our agenda for this evening. Before we disperse, we just have a couple of announcements, and I invite Virginia Gerbrandt to come to the stage for the announcements.
Hello. They said they would place me close to the stage, so I'm on that side. So just a few announcements. I want to thank everybody for coming. This room is full. They said over 400 people, so it's good to be here. We are the church together. And though it So as we do that, reminder that tomorrow, ensure that you come and you sit at the correct table. Plans have been made to facilitate this. Sit at your correct table and bring your name tags and ballots with you tomorrow when you come. And music starts at 8:30 in the morning, and the doors will open at 8, so you have plenty of time to find your spot and gather. And that is the announcements I have for today. The one mistake was made on my name. It's Virginia Gerbrandt Rickert, but they'll figure that out.
Okay. Well, we're going to close off this evening in a song together. And before we do that, someone mentioned that because we're going to be doing a lot of singing and worship, it might be good for you to know who is up here and who is leading you. My name is Moses Falco. I'm the pastor of Sterling Mennonite Fellowship in Winnipeg.
I'm Phil Campbell-Enns, an associate pastor at Bethel Mennonite here in Winnipeg.
Here in Winnipeg.
Alfred Penner, Douglas Mennonite Church.
I'm Vernell Enns Penner, lay minister at Douglas Mennonite Church.
And before on the piano, and she'll be back tomorrow, is Rebecca Clausen-Weeb from Charleswood.
We want to sing one closing song, The Lord Lift You Up, which is Sing the Journey, number 73. Let's stand to sing. We'll sing it through twice.